Campaign 2020 is sponsored by Wisconsin Hospital Association, Quick Trip, Wisconsin Counties Association, Wisconsin Realtors Association, and Wisconsin Operating Engineers Local 139.
Andi Rich of R-Marinette is a Republican running in the 89th Assembly District. The primary is August 11th. Andi, welcome to WisconsinEye.
Thank you. It's nice to be here.
Well, when I read your Facebook posts and your campaign materials, is it fair to say your biggest campaign issue is your frustration over progress in fighting PFAS? So talk about the PFAS threat, what you think should be done, and next steps in fighting it, please.
Absolutely. So R-Marinette is an epicenter of contamination from a company here that made AFFF aqueous foam to fight fires. And the byproduct of this foam is contaminating our entire area, and these chemicals that are being introduced into our environment were grandfathered in under the Toxic Substances Control Act of 1976, which means none of them have ever been tested for safety. So we're finding out they're dangerous after they've been in the environment for a while and people start getting sick. These chemicals are forever chemicals because they're non-biodegradable. So once they're introduced into the environment, they're here forever. They're toxic to humans, and we're not regulating them at all. So for the last year, we have actively been literally begging John Nygren to help us put some safety standards into place because the EPA is dragging their feet, not doing anything at the federal level. We know that there's a need here at the local level. And so what we want to do is introduce some legislation that would allow the DNR, based off of DHS findings, to implement safety standards for these chemicals, not just in the water, but in the air and in the soil. And because those levels will be based off of science, we can forego the standard 3-year process that it takes on an individual chemical basis and hopefully speed that up, group them as a class of chemicals, and put something in place for all of these things that takes out all of the excess paperwork of the emergency rules process for the DNR so that we can get protections now.
Okay, this is a very personal issue. Is your household on bottled water? Is your neighborhood on bottled water?
No, but anything that affects anybody in the community affects the whole community. You know, when price values go down in one area, it affects everybody. When something's not safe for some people, it truly, I mean, if it's not affecting you directly, it's affecting your friends and your family. So it is very personal, but I've been really fortunate to not be one of the people in the plume. I do, however, have a property that is adjacent to the contaminated fields from biosolid spreading according to DNR records. And I had some issues with my well, so I haven't actually gotten it tested yet. And now, because of this pandemic, some of the more affordable testing facilities have actually been closed down. So in order to test water anymore, it's a minimum $350 charge plus shipping is the cheapest we can find for a good lab.
Okay. Well, having watched different PFAS bills in the Capitol, I mean, there's been different version. The Assembly passed a bill that some considered watered down, and the Senate didn't act on it. Is that Mr. Nygren's fault that the Senate went home without acting on it?
Well, that's not quite what happened, and
Correct me then. Correct me.
Sure. The bill that got through the Assembly was a bill that Nygren wrote, but not really, because when I called his office to ask questions about it, they told me they couldn't answer my questions because they didn't write the bill. They borrowed it from another state, I believe they said. So that's one, and that's the foam bill. That's the only bill that actually addresses PFAS and passed out of the Assembly. However, when you actually look into that bill and read some of the verbiage in it, it's not protecting the people, it's protecting the corporations. It takes and and confirms legally that they have to abide by their own safety standards, which the DNR was forcing them to do already. And then one step further, it goes so far as to say that it is okay to use PFAS-free foam on any fire that's an emergency. Well, other than trainings, what fires aren't emergencies? So it basically just says, yeah, it's fine to use PFAS foam according to that bill's own verbiage. And to really drive it home on how much this is not a bill intended to protect the people, the verbiage in the bill says very clearly this bill is not intended to affect profits, sales, use, or manufacturing.
Okay.
So
I understand.
I feel a better bill would have been maybe a timeline or a rollout to guarantee that along with PFAS foams, there was PFAS-free foams on the trucks. There's going to be some implementation time, but that would have been more useful instead of saying, well, if all you have is PFAS foam on the truck and the fire's an emergency, you can use it.
Okay. Well, I understand how important PFAS is to you and your community, but there's a few other issues out there. So let's turn to those. The governor has said with the pandemic may cause state tax collections to drop this year, which starts today, fiscal year, by as much as $2 billion. If you're in the assembly, you got a difficult choice. Do you cut spending that has already been approved, some pretty important programs, or do you raise taxes or fees? What's your thoughts on where to turn?
I think when you are looking at this big of a shortfall of taxes, I believe the appropriate step would be to reassess the entire budget. When something like this happens, obviously it was unplanned. I believe we have to go back because our needs are changing as a state because of the pandemic, and our priorities also need to change. With everybody already having their own financial problems to deal with, I don't know that raising taxes is the right answer. I think we should take a bipartisan approach and truly try to find out how to redo a budget that focuses on the needs of the people and remove some of the fat in the budget that is more focused on protecting special interests and lobbyist concerns. And I think it has to be a full redo because there's just too much in there right now that no longer applies to our needs. Our expenses are changing, the programs that are necessary are changing, and more programs that I think we are going to need because of this pandemic are going to be lacking in that as well. So I really think we should sit down, bipartisan, and address it all at once, because otherwise you're just putting a Band-Aid on something that's going to come back to bite you later.
Okay, new subject. The Constitution says the party in power will draw the next lines for congressional, Senate, and Assembly district lines. The governor would like a People's Commission to draw the lines, then recommend that they be adopted to the elected officials. Which model is better?
I believe we have to take out those long shoots that are just in place to help the current sitting elected officials with future elections. And I think to look at this as an opportunity because the Republicans are in control now is a very short-sighted approach, because the Republicans might not be in control in 10 years. And so to pass something that ends gerrymandering, which is highly supported on both ends of the aisle to end gerrymandering, I think that's really the appropriate approach. Nobody wants unfair elections. And if you have good enough platforms and things that you're pushing, then you should be able to convince people to vote for you without rigging the system.
Okay, your position on both medical and recreational marijuana, Andi?
I think now more than ever is a great time to approve medical marijuana. I know in my assembly district, my opponent did a poll and 70% of people support it, even though he then didn't do anything with that information or pursue anything along those lines. Even with all the drug issues in our area, giving additional opportunities that aren't opioid and highly addictive is huge. And with all of the support that we have is huge. I personally would like to see it recreationally approved. I think that's going to help with disparities in criminal pursuits and the diversity issue that we're having, the systemic racism that we're having, and all of the ties that come back to how police force use marijuana to disproportionately criminalize minorities when it seems like across all races the use is very similar.
Well, a follow-up question dealing with that subject. Do we need new statewide standards?
So as a representative of the people, however, I don't in my district, I don't believe I have the full support of everybody. But with these changes, you know, and what we're seeing with all of the protests on racial discrimination, I think I'd like to try to reach out and see if the opinions have changed in my area so that I can also support recreational.
Okay. Andi, do we need a follow-up question on that issue? Do we need statewide standards on how police are trained? Do we need to ban chokeholds, no-knock warrants, keep a database of officers who are prone to using violence?
Yeah, it surprises me that we aren't already doing all of those things.
Okay. Let's talk about COVID. A couple questions. The pandemic has hit the economy and healthcare providers that the state relies on. Recessions cause less revenues for state, more demands for safety net programs like Medicaid. If you're a member of the Assembly next year voting on the next state budget, would you want more of a priority given to Wisconsin hospitals in terms of funding?
That's hard to say. I think we need to see where we're at after we go through, because I don't want to take a one-size-fits-all approach for the entire state. We already know that our rural areas are struggling with lack of care options, but what works out in the rural hospitals isn't necessarily going to be necessary in the city hospitals. And so I believe that instead of focusing on all hospitals, we should see where we're at after this progresses through the summer and where we want to be, because I don't think it's right to prop up any industry that isn't actually working. Like, look at what happened with our big corporate bailouts this last round. Basically, I talked to people working all over my city, and we're a manufacturing town, and they're being paid to go to work and not do their normal workload. And the only reason that we're giving that type of bailout is because those people are making their full wages still to not make the products, and the higher ups are still getting their full wages, which is a huge problem. And that bailout was clearly not getting the money where it's needed, because for a country who, for the amount of money that we sent out, we could have given every household $20,000. We shouldn't be now facing this crisis of some people can't put food on their tables.
Okay. Should businesses that follow all the prescribed COVID-19 practices and recommendations, should they be immune from frivolous lawsuits?
I'm sorry, you're cutting out a little, but no.
Businesses that follow all the prescribed COVID-19 health and safety standards, should they be immune from frivolous lawsuits?
I don't think we should grant immunity to lawsuits to anybody. It's just, I think that's bad policy to tell somebody that they're exempt from prosecution. If they're following all the rules, are they also, following up to make sure that those rules that they're implementing are being followed by the employees? I think there's too many variables. And while nobody wants to see frivolous lawsuits, I don't believe in just telling anybody that they're not going to be pursued, either. I think that's a big problem with what we did with vaccines. I think that it gives people the ability to cut corners and not, truly be responsible. Nobody wants a frivolous lawsuit, but how do you put that into action and have it be fair to make sure that you're still protecting employees and the workers?
Okay. 2 questions on property taxes. They're fairly high in Wisconsin, which is why what school districts and local governments can levy in property taxes, there's limits and caps, although you can get around the limits and caps if you pass a referendum. My question, if you're a member of the Assembly, would you vote to end those limits and caps on property tax levies or keep them in place?
I think what we need to do is take the part of our bills that say that the online tax revenue is going to go for income tax relief and remove that mandate. See where we're at with these increased online sales from the pandemic, and if that money can help us offset. Because the last thing I want to do is, put that extra financial burden on our, fixed income or elderly homeowners who just don't have it in the budget to pay extra property taxes. And if we can remove, that mandate stating that online sales taxes are going to go for income tax relief, now's not the right time for that. And I think if we redirect those funds to a more appropriate place, then we can reassess our situation and see if there's still a need.
Okay. Counties and municipalities this is another property tax question, rely on the property tax to pay for 40% of the services they provide. That's seventh highest in the nation and 10 percentage points higher than any other Midwest state. Is it time to look for alternative revenue sources for local governments to the property tax? Specifically, should we broaden the sales tax, the 5% state sales tax, to now exempt products and services? Do you have a position on that?
I'm sorry, I didn't understand. Exempt?
Do local units of government, instead of relying so much on the property tax, should they have the ability to look to alternative sources of revenue, for example, broadening our sales tax to now exempt products and services?
I'm not a big fan of raising taxes in general, but the good news is I do think that the legislature can still help with this problem. I think that what we've been doing for too long is mandating requirements for local municipalities and governments, but not providing funding for it. So if we reassess that and require, instead of pushing off unfunded mandates onto the local governments that don't have those revenue streams, and try to find where that money is coming from in our state budget, I think we will help alleviate a lot of that burden that the local municipalities and governments are finding. And since I think now is the time to go through the budget and redo it as a whole, there's a lot of opportunity there to correct some of that and help take some of that financial burden off of the local governments without forcing them to raise taxes on other people by streamlining what's really necessary. And again, getting rid of a lot of the stuff that's in there because special interests and lobbyists convinced, representatives that their needs are greater than the people's.
Okay, just two final questions. In 2015, out-of-state contractors were awarded $72 million in contracts for public works projects by local governments. That number, $72 million, more than doubled to $146 million in 2018. My question, should bidding standards and requirements give preferences to Wisconsin companies when local governments authorize public works projects?
Preference, absolutely, but I don't believe in making it a requirement because of things like, the abilities to address the projects and timing and time frame.
Okay.
Yes, I think we should prioritize employing our local citizens, implement more government than necessary to try to mandate it or make it so that it's a requirement, because based off of circumstances and what timing allows and what type of ability local companies have to address this in a timely manner, we don't want to hamstring ourselves either.
Okay. Because of technical issues, Andi, I think we better cut it off there. We're both kind of breaking up. So I want to thank Andi Rich of Marinette. She's a Republican running in the 89th Assembly District. The primary is August 11th. Andi, thank you for talking to WisconsinEye.
Thank you very much, Steve. It was a pleasure to be here.
Thanks so much.
Campaign 2020 is sponsored by Wisconsin Hospital Association, Quick Trip, Wisconsin Counties Association, Wisconsin Realtors Association, and Wisconsin Operating Engineers Local 139.